The land itself was a promise and a threat, locked in a constant, silent battle. In Wyoming, 1885, the world felt stripped down to its bones. The vast prairie stretched out under a sky so immense it could make a man feel like an ant or a god, depending on the day. Today, it felt like the former. The wind, a ceaseless tormentor, scoured the plains, picking up dust and grit that stung the eyes and coated the back of the throat. It was a wind that knew nothing of mercy, that peeled paint from wood, stole warmth from a fire, and whispered of loneliness in the dead of night. The earth was cracked, a web of fissures sprawling across the hard-baked ground where the sun had beaten it into submission. Sagebrush, tough and stubborn, clung to life, their silvery green a stark contrast to the monotonous brown of the dirt and the pale, sun-bleached grass. Eli Carson's ranch was a lonely island in this sea of desolation. A small, sturdy cabin hewn from cottonwood logs, a barn that leaned ever so slightly as if weary of the wind's assault, and a few corrals were the only signs of human defiance for miles in any direction. Inside the cabin, the silence was a physical weight. It was a new kind of silence. For 28 years, this space had been filled with the presence of his mother, Martha Carson. It had not been a warm presence, but it had been a presence nonetheless. 2 weeks ago, he had buried her on the small rise behind the cabin, next to the grave of a father he barely remembered. He dug the grave himself, the rhythmic thud of the shovel against the unyielding earth the only eulogy she received. Martha had been a woman forged from the same unforgiving landscape she had chosen to inhabit. Her hands were hard, her words were harder, and her heart was a fortress. She believed in work, duty, and God, in that order. Love was a frivolous word, a weakness for poets and city folk. A man needed a helpmeet, a woman needed a provider. It was a transaction, a partnership for survival, and anything more was an invitation for ruin. She had controlled his life with a quiet, unbending will, her disapproval a more effective barrier than any locked door. Now, she was gone. The silence she left behind was not peaceful. It was hollow, an echo in a space that had suddenly grown too large for one man. Eli stood by the window, his reflection a ghostly image against the vast, empty plains. He was a young man, but the land and its hardships had carved maturity into his features. His shoulders were broad from a life of labor, his hands calloused and capable, his eyes the color of a stormy sky, held a watchfulness that rarely softened. He was his mother's son, hard, practical, and deeply suspicious of the softer sentiments that seemed to govern other men. He'd tried love once. He'd allowed himself to feel that reckless, consuming fire, and the burns still ached on cold nights. His mother, with her unerring instinct for what she considered weakness, had helped extinguish it. Her cold logic and sharp words like buckets of water on the flames. After that, Eli had built his own fortress around his heart, reinforcing the walls his mother had first constructed. But the emptiness of the cabin was becoming unbearable. At night, the wind moaned around the eaves like a restless spirit, and the creak of the floorboards was the only reply to his own breathing. He was lonely. It wasn't a desperate, aching loneliness, but a practical, gnawing one. The chores were endless. The solitude was eroding something vital within him. He didn't want a wife to cherish, to whisper secrets to in the dark. He didn't believe in that anymore. He needed a partner, a presence to fill the silence, a pair of hands to share the crushing weight of survival. The decision, when it came, was as pragmatic as shoeing a horse. He sat at the rough-hewn table one evening, the oil lamp casting flickering shadows on the log walls, and stared at a copy of the matrimonial messenger that a ranch hand had left behind months ago. The words seemed foreign, transactional. A comely widow of good standing seeks a husband of means. A young woman of gentle breeding desires correspondence with a homesteader. It felt clinical, like ordering a new plow or a sack of seed. It felt safe. There would be no illusions, no dangerous tangle of emotions. It would be an arrangement, a bargain struck against the wilderness. He would offer a home and security. She would offer companionship and her labor. It was a fair trade. With a resolve that surprised him, he took a pen and a sheet of paper and began to write. He kept it brief, honest, and stripped of all poetry. He was a rancher. He owned 320 acres, a small herd of cattle. He was seeking a wife. He made no promises of affection, only of provision and respect. Weeks turned into a month, and the replies trickled in. Most were flowery and filled with romantic notions he couldn't stomach. He burned them without a second thought. Then, one letter arrived that was different. The envelope was plain, the penmanship neat and clear, without flourish. It came from a Miss Clara Fairchild of Scranton, Pennsylvania. Her letter was like his own, direct, honest, and unadorned. She wrote that she was 24 years old, the daughter of a coal miner who had perished in a collapse years earlier. She had worked as a teacher in a one-room schoolhouse until recently. She made no secret of her circumstances. She had been betrothed to a man, a clerk from town, but when her family's meager savings were lost, his affections had cooled, and the engagement was broken. She did not write of heartbreak, only of the practical reality of her situation. She was alone, with few prospects, and sought not a grand romance, but a new beginning, a life of purpose. She wrote of her willingness to work hard, her understanding that life in the West would be a challenge. There was a quiet dignity in her words, a sense of resilience that spoke to him. She wasn't looking for a savior, she was looking for a partner. Eli read her letter 3 times. He saw not a delicate flower from the east, but a sapling that had learned to bend in the wind without breaking. He wrote back, his reply just as concise as his first. He included the money for her train ticket. The day Clara was due to arrive, Eli rode into the small, dusty town of Laramie. It was a rough-and-tumble place, a collection of wooden storefronts, saloons, and a single church, all huddled together against the vastness of the prairie. He felt a knot of apprehension tighten in his stomach. This was real. A woman he'd never met was about to become his wife. He waited on the train platform, his hat pulled low, feeling the curious stares of the townsfolk. When the train hissed to a stop, belching steam and smoke, she was one of the last to disembark. She was taller than he'd imagined, and thinner, but she held herself with a straight-backed posture that belied any fragility. She wore a simple, dark traveling dress, her face pale and tired from the long journey. Her hair, the color of dark honey, was pinned neatly in a bun, though stray wisps had escaped to frame her face. When her eyes, a clear, intelligent gray, met his, she did not look away. She simply gave a small, hesitant nod. "Mr. Carson?" she asked, her voice softer than he expected. "Ma'am," he replied, touching the brim of his hat. "Welcome to Wyoming." The silence between them on the wagon ride back to his ranch was thick and awkward. Eli pointed out landmarks, a distant butte, a dry creek bed, in a gruff attempt at conversation. Clara sat straight on the wagon seat, her hands folded primly in her lap, her gaze sweeping across the endless, rolling landscape. He could only imagine what she was thinking. This raw, untamed land was a world away from the green hills of Pennsylvania. He wondered if he saw fear in her eyes, or regret, but her expression was unreadable, a mask of calm composure. The wedding took place the following day. It was a starkly simple affair, officiated by a circuit judge in his dusty office. The judge's wife and the town blacksmith served as witnesses. Eli had bought Clara a new dress, a practical calico of dark blue, a purchase that felt more like outfitting a new ranch hand than wedding a bride. Clara accepted it with a quiet, "Thank you, it's very fine." She wore it to the ceremony, and as she stood beside him, repeating the vows that would bind them together, he felt a strange sense of detachment, as if he were watching a scene unfold from a great distance. He was a husband, The woman beside him, a virtual stranger, was his wife. When the judge pronounced them man and wife, he simply nodded, then led her out of the office and back to the wagon. There was no celebration, no wedding feast. There was only the long, quiet ride back to the ranch, to a life that had been irrevocably altered for them both. Clara's introduction to her new home was a baptism by hardship. The cabin, which had seemed sufficient for Eli and his mother, felt cramped and primitive through her eyes. There was no running water, save for the pump outside that required a strong arm to prime. The wind found every crack in the log walls, bringing with it a fine layer of dust that settled on everything. The work was relentless, a dawn-to-dusk cycle of chores that were completely alien to her. Her hands, accustomed to holding chalk and books, were soon red and raw from scrubbing floors with harsh lye soap, hauling buckets of water and washing clothes on a scrub board until her knuckles ached. She learned to cook on the cast-iron stove, battling its fickle temperament to produce meals from their meager stores of flour, beans, and salted meat. She tried to cultivate a small vegetable garden near the cabin, her efforts a constant struggle against the dry soil and the relentless sun. But the physical labor, as grueling as it was not the hardest part. It was the isolation that truly tested her spirit. Back in Scranton, even in her poverty, she had been surrounded by the sounds of life, the rattle of carts on cobblestone streets, the chatter of neighbors, the laughter of her students. Here, the only sounds were the caw of a distant raven, the lowing of cattle, and the eternal, moaning song of the wind. There were no neighbors to call on, no friendly faces to meet at a market. The nearest homestead was over 10 miles away, a distance that felt like 100. Eli was her only companion, and he was a man who seemed to prefer the company of silence. He was not unkind to her. He was a dutiful, if distant, husband. He treated her with a formal respect, always referring to her as ma'am in those first few weeks. He showed her how to perform her tasks with a gruff patience, his instructions clear and concise. He repaired the leaky roof, chopped an endless supply of firewood, and ensured their larder was never empty. He provided for her, just as he had promised. But he never touched her, save for an accidental brushing of hands as they passed a tool or a plate. He never shared his thoughts, never spoke of his past, never asked about hers. At night, they maintained a careful distance. Eli had added a small room for her onto the cabin before she arrived, a simple space with a narrow bed and a small window. He would retire to his own bed on the other side of the main room, and the silence between them was a chasm. Clara would lie awake, listening to the lonely cry of a coyote, feeling the immensity of the darkness outside pressing in on her. She felt like a ghost in this house, a hired hand who happened to share a man's name. The loneliness was a cold, heavy ache in her chest, a stark contrast to the quiet hope she had harbored on the long train ride west. Yet, Clara did not despair. She possessed a core of inner strength that Eli had sensed in her letter. She had faced loss and disappointment before, and she would face this. She did not complain. She did not weep, at least not where he could see. She simply worked. She rose before the sun, her movements quiet and efficient. She put her mind to mastering her new life. She learned to bake bread that was light and edible, to mend Eli's worn shirts with neat, almost invisible stitches, to read the sky for signs of changing weather. She brought a semblance of order and civility to the rustic cabin, scrubbing the floors until they shone, placing a jar of wildflowers on the table, and humming softly to herself as she worked. Eli watched her. From the corner of his eye, he observed her quiet, relentless industry. He saw the blisters on her hands that she tried to hide. He noticed the way her shoulders slumped with exhaustion at the end of the day, only to straighten again with resolve the next morning. He had expected complaints, tears, a demand to be sent back east. He had been prepared for failure. But Clara did not fail. She endured. A grudging respect began to take root in him. She was tougher than he'd given her credit for. She had grit. He started leaving a bucket of fresh water for her inside the door each morning to save her the first trip to the pump. He once returned from a trip to town with a small packet of lemon drops, which he left on the table for her without a word. They were small gestures, tiny cracks in the wall he kept around himself. One evening, a storm rolled in, one of those violent prairie squalls that seemed to rip the sky apart. Thunder cracked overhead like a celestial whip, and rain lashed against the cabin. Eli was checking the livestock in the barn when a bolt of lightning struck a nearby cottonwood tree, splitting it with a deafening roar. He ran back to the cabin, bursting through the door to find Clara standing stock still in the middle of the room, her face white as bleached bone, her hands pressed to her mouth. For a moment, he saw not the capable, composed woman she presented to him every day, but a frightened girl, alone and terrified 1,000 miles from everything she had ever known. An unfamiliar impulse moved him. He stepped forward and placed a hand on her shoulder. "It's all right," he said, his voice rough. "Just the storm. The cabin is solid." She flinched at his touch but didn't pull away. She looked up at him, and in her wide, gray eyes, he saw a depth of loneliness that mirrored his own. The air between them shifted, charged with something more than the storm outside. It was a moment of shared vulnerability, a fleeting connection in the heart of the tempest. He could feel the slight tremble of her shoulder beneath his palm. He should let go. He should step back, retreat to the safety of his silence. But for a long second, he didn't. He kept his hand there, a silent, awkward offering of comfort. He was her husband. This was his duty. Yet, as he looked into her eyes, he felt the ghost of an old pain stir within him, a sharp, familiar warning. It was the wound he had sworn never to let anyone touch again. He pulled his hand back as if burned, the distance rushing back in to fill the space between them. "I'll add more wood to the fire," he said, turning away abruptly, his voice once again clipped and remote. Clara watched him go, the warmth of his hand lingering on her shoulder for a moment before fading. She said nothing, but a quiet understanding settled in her heart. He was a man with walls as high and as vast as the Wyoming sky, and she, his wife, was still standing on the outside. The autumn storms gave way to the iron grip of winter with a sudden, brutal ferocity. For 3 days, a blizzard raged, a screaming white fury that erased the horizon and buried the world under a thick blanket of snow. The wind howled like a legion of damned souls, and Eli and Clara were prisoners in the small cabin. The world shrunk to the space between their 4 walls. When the storm finally broke on the 4th morning, it left behind a landscape of unnatural stillness and blinding white. The sky was a pale, washed-out blue, and the silence was so profound it seemed to have a sound of its own. It was in this pristine, silent world that Eli saw her, a dark speck, staggering through the deep drifts a 1/4 mile from the cabin. At first, he thought it was a trick of the light, perhaps a deer that had lost its way, but the shape was human. Cursing under his breath, he pulled on his heavy coat and boots and plunged out into the biting cold, the snow crunching loudly under his feet. As he drew closer, the figure resolved into a woman, her clothes little more than tattered rags frozen stiff against her body. She was moving with a desperate, lurching gait, falling and pushing herself back up, her progress agonizingly slow. In her arms, she clutched a bundle wrapped in a thin, worn blanket. He reached her just as she stumbled for the last time, collapsing into the snow. He rolled her over, and the breath caught in his throat, a shard of ice in his lungs. The face, gaunt and blue with cold, the cheeks hollowed out by starvation and despair, was one he had never expected to see again. It was a face from another life, a ghost resurrected from the grave of his memory. "Miriam," he breathed, the name a pained whisper on the frigid air. Her eyes, wild and unfocused, flickered open. A spark of recognition, faint and fleeting, crossed her features. Her chapped lips moved, but no sound came out. Her gaze drifted down to the bundle she held with a fierce, protective grip, even in her delirium. "Help him," she finally rasped, her voice a dry crackle. "Please, my boy, he's so cold." Eli's eyes fell to the small bundle. He knew. Even before he reached out and gently pulled back a corner of the blanket, he knew. The face of the child within was waxen and still, the tiny lips tinged with blue. There was no life there, only the perfect, tragic stillness of death. A wave of profound pity and a cold, familiar anger washed over Eli. He looked from the dead child to the woman who was its mother, the woman he had once loved with a desperate, youthful fire. Gently, he scooped her up into his arms. She was terrifyingly light, as if she were made of nothing but bone and sorrow. "I've got you, Miriam," he said, his voice thick. "I've got you." He turned back toward the cabin, his boots sinking deep with every heavy step, carrying the woman and her tragic burden home. Clara saw them coming from the window. She had a pot of coffee boiling on the stove, and she opened the door, a question on her lips that died when she saw the state of the woman in Eli's arms. She saw the tattered clothes, the frost-nipped skin, and the raw despair on the stranger's face. Then she saw the small, still bundle, and her hand flew to her mouth, a silent gasp of horror and compassion. "Get the bed ready," Eli grunted, his voice strained. "And heat some water." Clara didn't ask questions. She moved with a swift efficiency, pulling back the quilts on her own bed, her mind racing. This was a crisis, a matter of life and death, and her role was clear. Together, they laid Miriam down. Her body was racked with violent shivers, her breathing shallow and ragged, as Eli worked to cut away her frozen, ragged dress. Clara gently tried to take the bundle from her arms. Miriam resisted, a guttural moan of protest rising in her throat. Her eyes flew open, wide with panic. "No, my boy! Don't take my boy!" "Miriam," Eli said, his voice low and steady, his hands resting on her shoulders. "Miriam, listen to me. It's Eli. You're safe, but you have to let go. He's gone." The words, brutal in their finality, seemed to penetrate her delirium. A great, shuddering sob escaped her, a sound of such profound agony that it seemed to shake the very logs of the cabin. Her grip loosened, and Clara carefully took the small, cold body. Tears streamed down Clara's own face as she wrapped the child in a clean linen sheet and laid him gently in his wooden cradle. A cradle she had found in the loft and cleaned. A silent hope for a future that now seemed impossibly distant. For the next 2 days, Miriam drifted in a feverish haze, hovering between life and death. Clara was a constant, tireless presence at her bedside. She bathed Miriam's fevered skin, spooned warm broth between her cracked lips, and changed her dressings with a gentle competence that belied her inexperience. She was the picture of dutiful compassion, the model wife tending to a fallen stranger. Eli was a shadow in the background, chopping extra wood, ensuring the cabin stayed warm, his face a grim, unreadable mask. But when he looked at the woman in the bed, his carefully constructed walls began to crumble. This was not just a stranger. This was Miriam. And seeing her like this, broken and ravaged, was like watching a part of his own past burn to ashes. On the 3rd day, Miriam's fever broke. She woke with clear eyes, the delirium gone, replaced by a vast, hollow emptiness. The first thing she asked for was her son. Eli had to tell her again, his voice cracking, that the boy had succumbed to the inflammation in his lungs during the storm. He had already buried the small body on the hill, next to his mother's grave, in a small pine box he had hastily built. The news didn't bring a fresh storm of grief, only a terrible, quiet finality. Miriam simply closed her eyes, and a single tear traced a path through the grime on her cheek. Later that evening, as Clara changed the bandage on a deep cut on Miriam's arm, Miriam spoke, her voice weak but steady. I have nowhere to go. It wasn't a question. It was a simple statement of fact. I was trying to reach some distant cousins near Fort Laramie. I sent a letter. I need to wait for a reply. Just a few days. Then I'll be out of your way. Eli stood by the fire, his back to them, but his shoulders were rigid. Clara looked from Miriam's pleading eyes to Eli's stiff back. This was her home, her marriage. But how could she refuse? How could any decent person turn this woman out into the merciless winter? You will stay as long as you need, Clara said, her voice firm, leaving no room for argument. You need to rest. You need to heal. Eli turned then, his eyes meeting Clara's for a long moment. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod of gratitude. And in that moment, Clara felt a cold premonition, a flicker of understanding that the arrival of this woman was not just a disruption, but a fundamental shift in the landscape of their lives. As Miriam slowly regained her strength, the history between her and Eli began to fill the silences in the small cabin. For Clara, it was a ghost story she was learning piece by piece. For Eli, it was a flood of memories he had spent years trying to dam up. He remembered a Miriam who was nothing like the broken woman in his wife's bed. He remembered a girl of 17, with eyes the color of moss and a laugh that could startle birds from the trees. Her father was a prospector, a man with a reputation for drink and wild schemes, always chasing a fortune that remained just beyond his grasp. To Eli's mother, Martha, the family was shiftless, landless, and utterly unsuitable. But to a young Eli, suffocating under his mother's rigid control, Miriam was freedom. They had met in secret, in a hidden grove of aspens down by the creek. Their love was a wild, desperate thing, fueled by the certainty of its impossibility. She was all fire and passion, challenging his quiet nature, pulling a smile from his stern face, making him feel a terrifying, exhilarating rush of life. He had promised her everything. He was going to build a life for them, away from his mother's disapproving gaze. They had made plans. They had dreamed. But Martha Carson had been a formidable opponent. She had discovered their secret, and her reaction was not fiery, but cold and absolute. She did not forbid it. She dismantled it with cruel precision. She spoke of duty, of family, of the shame Miriam's name would bring. She painted a picture of a life of ruin and poverty, preying on his deepest fears of failure. She gave him an ultimatum: the girl, or the ranch that was his birthright. Young, overwhelmed, and conditioned to obey, he had faltered. He chose the land. He broke Miriam's heart, and his own. In the process, he told himself it was for her own good. He told himself it was the only sensible thing to do. The last time he saw her, her moss-green eyes were filled with a betrayal so profound it had haunted him ever since. Months later, he heard she had been married off to a freight hauler from Cheyenne, a man twice her age with a reputation for a heavy hand. Eli had buried his guilt and his grief under a mountain of hard work and sworn he would never allow himself to feel that way again. Now, that past was sitting by his fire, wrapped in one of Clara's shawls, and the guilt was fresh and raw. The nights became a new kind of trial. After their meager supper, Clara would often retire to her room, pleading fatigue, though she would lie awake in the dark, listening. In the main room, bathed in the flickering firelight, Miriam would talk. Her story came out in hushed, broken pieces, a litany of sorrow whispered into the shadows. She spoke of her husband, a man whose kindness had been a thin veneer for a deep-seated cruelty. She never used the word abuse, but Clara, listening through the thin wall, could hear it in the pauses, in the way Miriam's voice would tremble and then fall silent. She spoke of running, of taking her infant son and fleeing in the dead of night with nothing but the clothes on her back. She described years spent on the move, taking work where she could find it, a laundress, a cook in a mining camp, always looking over her shoulder, always afraid. Her son, Daniel, had been her only reason for living. a small point of light in an endless darkness.
"He was a good baby,"
she whispered one night, her eyes fixed on the flames.
"He never cried much.
It was like he knew we had to be quiet. We were in a line shack near the Platte when he got sick, a cough, at first, then the fever came. I was trying to get him to a doctor in Laramie, but the storm, it came so fast." Her voice broke. "He died in my arms. He just stopped breathing. I kept walking. I didn't know what else to do." Eli sat across from her, his hands clenched on his knees, his face etched with a pain that was more than just pity. He was seeing the direct consequence of his long-ago choice. The vibrant girl was gone, and in her place was this survivor, bearing wounds he felt responsible for inflicting. His gaze on her was no longer that of a rancher offering shelter to a stranger. It was something older, deeper, and infinitely more complicated. It was the look of a man staring at the ghost of a life he had abandoned. Clara felt the change. She saw it in the lingering glances, in the way Eli's voice softened when he spoke to Miriam. She saw how he made sure Miriam had the warmest spot by the fire, how he brought her a cup of coffee without being asked. They were small things, but in the quiet, Spartan world of the ranch, they were everything. A threat began to bloom in Clara's heart, a cold fear that she was becoming a spectator to a story that had begun long before she had ever arrived. She fought it with the only weapon she had, duty and diligence. She kept the house immaculate. She cooked and cleaned and mended with a fierce determination. She tended to Miriam's needs with a gentle, unwavering kindness, never betraying the turmoil within her. She was the perfect wife, the perfect hostess, a pillar of Christian charity. But at night, alone in her cold bed, she felt her own quiet desperation growing. She was Mrs. Carson. She had his name, but this other woman, this ghost from the past, seemed to possess his soul. One night, the wind rose again, shrieking around the cabin, rattling the windows in their frames. It was a sound that scraped at raw nerves, a reminder of the blizzard that had brought Miriam to their door. A log shifted in the fireplace, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. The sudden noise, coupled with the howling wind, made Miriam cry out. A sharp, terrified sound. She was sitting on the floor by the hearth, and she scrambled to her feet, her eyes wide with a primal fear. "The storm," she whispered, her body trembling uncontrollably. "It's coming back." Eli was on his feet in an instant. "It's just the wind. Miriam, you're safe here." But she was lost in a memory, her breathing coming in ragged gasps. "I can't. It's so cold. I can't get warm." She wrapped her arms around herself, but the shaking wouldn't stop. She looked at Eli, her eyes pleading, stripped of all pretense. "Please," she begged, her voice a child's whimper. "Don't let me be cold. Just hold me, please. Eli, hold me tight." Clara stood frozen in the doorway of her room, a silent witness to the scene unfolding in the firelight. She saw the raw struggle on Eli's face. He looked from Miriam's terrified expression to the closed door of his wife's room. A man caught between two worlds. His duty was to Clara. His heart, his guilt, his entire past was pulling him toward Miriam. The battle lasted only a second. With a low groan of surrender, he stepped forward and pulled Miriam into his arms. He held her tightly, his large hands stroking her back as she sobbed against his chest. It was not the embrace of a lover, but something far more intimate, an embrace of shared history, of profound sorrow, of a comfort he could offer no one else, and that no one else could offer him. He buried his face in her hair, his eyes closing as if in pain. From the shadows, Clara watched. She saw every detail, the way Eli's powerful arms enveloped Miriam's frail form, the way Miriam clung to him as if he were her only anchor in a raging sea. There was no anger in Clara's heart. There was no righteous indignation. There was only a vast, hollow ache, a cold and certain knowledge that she was utterly, completely alone. She did not make a sound. She simply backed away, retreating into the darkness of her room and pulling the door silently shut. The aftermath of that night settled over the cabin like a fine layer of frost, chilling everything it touched. The embrace Clara had witnessed was never spoken of, yet it became a third presence in the room, a silent entity that altered the gravity between them all. The careful, fragile routine they had established was fractured. Eli, Clara, and Miriam now moved around each other with a new, painful awareness, their words carefully measured, their glances fleeting, freighted with unspoken meaning. Clara's inner world, once ordered by duty and a quiet, resilient hope, began to fray. The woman who had faced hardship with stoic resolve now found herself battling a far more insidious enemy, doubt. In the quiet hours before dawn, as she kneaded dough with hands that were now chapped and calloused, her thoughts would drift back to Scranton. She didn't miss the poverty or the pitying looks from the townspeople after her engagement was broken. What she missed was the certainty. She missed knowing who she was. She had been Miss Fairchild, the school teacher. Her world had been one of books, chalk dust, and the predictable rhythms of the school year. She had a place, a purpose. She was respected for her mind and her gentle nature. Here, in this vast, empty land, her value felt terrifyingly mutable. What was a schoolteacher's knowledge worth when faced with a frozen pump or a sick calf? What was her quiet dignity against the raw, elemental force of a shared history she could never be a part of? She would watch Eli and Miriam, and a cold wave of inadequacy would wash over her. They shared a language of memories, of glances and half-finished sentences that she could never learn. They were two trees grown from the same soil, their roots tangled deep beneath the surface. She was a transplant, struggling to survive in foreign earth. She began to study herself in the small, cracked mirror that hung by the wash basin. She saw a plain face, her features drawn and tired from work and worry. Her hands were no longer the hands of a teacher, but they weren't yet the capable, confident hands of a true frontier woman. They were caught in between. Like her, she was Mrs. Carson, the wife, but she felt like an imposter. The title felt like a borrowed dress that didn't quite fit. She felt herself shrinking, her presence in the cabin becoming more transparent each day, while Miriam's seemed to grow more solid, more vibrant. Eli, trapped in the cross-currents of past and present, retreated further into himself. He treated both women with an excruciating, impartial courtesy that was a torment to them both. He spoke to Clara about the household needs, to Miriam about her improving health. He worked from before sunup to long after sundown, driving himself to the point of exhaustion, as if he could physically beat back the emotions that threatened to overwhelm him. He was a man walking a tightrope stretched over a chasm of his own making. To lean one way was to betray his wife and his vows. To lean the other was to deny the profound, guilt-ridden pull he felt toward the woman he had wronged, the woman who represented the life he had sacrificed for duty. His silence was not empty. It was a roaring battleground, and the tension emanating from him was a constant, low hum in the cabin. As the weeks passed and the snow began to melt under the strengthening sun, Miriam began to change. Health was a slow, beautiful dawn on her features. The gaunt hollows of her cheeks filled out, and a healthy color returned, chasing away the gray pallor of grief and starvation. The haunted, hunted look in her eyes was replaced by a deep, watchful stillness. The ordeal had stripped away everything extraneous about her, leaving behind an essential, unadorned strength. Her beauty, which had been buried under layers of suffering, re-emerged. But it was different now. It was not the soft, cultivated prettiness of an Eastern woman like Clara. It was a wild, untamed beauty, forged in hardship. There was a boldness in her gaze, a directness that could be unsettling. Her movements, once faltering, became fluid and confident. She learned the rhythms of the ranch quickly, her hands as capable with an axe as they were with a needle. She would stand at the edge of the prairie, her dark hair coming loose in the wind, and she looked not like a visitor, but like a part of the landscape itself, as rugged and as resilient. She was a different kind of woman than Clara. Not better or worse, but fundamentally different. A hawk to Clara's dove. And Eli, despite himself, could not help but watch her. The breaking point came on a cool, bright afternoon in early spring. The air was clean and sharp, carrying the smell of damp earth and new life. Eli was splitting logs for the woodpile, the rhythmic crack of the axe, the only sound in the vast quiet. Miriam came out of the cabin, a shawl around her shoulders, and began to help him stack the wood, her movements easy and practiced. Clara watched them from the window as she churned butter, the steady, circular motion of her hands a stark contrast to the turbulence in her heart. They worked in comfortable silence for a while, a team that needed no words. Then, as Eli paused to wipe the sweat from his brow, Miriam stopped and looked at him, her expression one of intense, unreadable emotion.
"Thank you, Eli,"
she said, her voice low.
"for everything. You saved my life."
"Anyone would have done the same," he said gruffly, not meeting her eyes, his attention fixed on the axe handle in his hands.
"No,"
she said, stepping closer.
"Not anyone."
She reached out and laid a hand on his arm, over the coarse wool of his shirt. He flinched, but didn't pull away.
"You did it. After what happened between us, you still took me in."
He finally looked at her, and the carefully constructed dam of his composure began to give way. In her moss-green eyes, he saw the past and the present collide, the ghost of the girl he had loved, and the powerful woman she had become. Before he could speak, before he could think, she rose on her toes and pressed her lips to his. It was not a tentative, questioning kiss. It was a kiss of profound, desperate gratitude, of resurrected feelings, of a woman reclaiming a piece of a life that had been stolen from her. It was brief, but it was electric, a lightning strike on a clear day, for a heartbeat. Eli was frozen, lost in the familiar scent of her hair, the soft pressure of her lips. The years fell away, and he was 20 years old again, standing in a grove of aspens, his world alight with impossible love. Then reality crashed back in. The image of Clara's calm, gray eyes flashed in his mind. With a strangled curse, he broke away. Stumbling back a step, he pushed her away, not roughly, but with the definitive motion of a man tearing himself from a fire.
"Miriam, don't!"
he rasped, his voice raw. She looked at him, her chest rising and falling, her lips slightly parted. She showed no shame, no regret, only a deep, knowing sorrow. She had her answer. She could see it in his eyes. He had pushed her away with his hands, but his eyes were blazing with a fire he hadn't been able to extinguish. She gave a small, sad nod, turned without another word, and walked back into the cabin. Eli stood for a long time, his knuckles white on the axe handle, his heart hammering against his ribs. He felt like a traitor. He felt like he was drowning. Inside, Clara saw everything. She had seen Miriam's approach, the touch, the kiss. She had seen Eli's momentary surrender and his violent recoil. An earlier version of herself would have dissolved into tears, would have felt the sting of betrayal as a physical blow. But the woman at the butter churn was no longer that naive girl from Scranton. The prairie had hardened her, had taught her that survival required a different kind of response. She felt a pang, a sharp, cold jab of pain in her chest, but it was quickly replaced by a strange, chilling clarity. She did not confront Miriam. She did not confront Eli when he finally came inside, his face like a thundercloud. She simply continued her work, her movements calm and measured. She observed them. She saw the new, agonizing awkwardness that hung between them. She saw the way Miriam now avoided his gaze, and the way Eli's eyes followed Miriam when he thought no one was looking. She saw it all, and she understood. Hysteria would accomplish nothing. Accusations would only drive a deeper wedge. She was his wife. She had a claim, a right that Miriam did not, and she decided, with a cold, terrifying resolve, that she would fight for it. That night, the tension in the cabin was a palpable thing, thicker than the wood smoke. After a supper eaten in near total silence, Miriam pleaded a headache and retreated to the small cot that had been set up for her in a corner of the main room. Clara cleaned the dishes, her mind a whirlwind of calculation and fear. When she was finished, she did not go to her own small room. She walked to where Eli sat staring into the fire, his shoulders slumped with the weight of his guilt. She stood behind him for a moment, her heart pounding. Then, she placed a hand on his shoulder. He started, turning to look up at her, his expression a mixture of surprise and dread. "It is time for bed, husband," she said, her voice quiet but unwavering. She did not wait for a reply. She turned and walked into his room, the room she had never entered, and lit the small lamp beside his bed. He followed a moment later, standing hesitantly in the doorway like a stranger. The room was small and Spartan, containing only his bed, a small table, and a wooden chest. It smelled of him, of leather, sawdust, and the clean scent of the outdoors. Clara stood by the bed, her hands clasped in front of her. She was terrified, but she did not let it show. This was her ground, her right. She was his wife. "You made a vow to me, Eli," she said softly, not as an accusation, but as a statement of fact, before God. He looked at the floor, unable to meet her gaze. "Clara, She interrupted him, taking a step closer. "I am your wife," she repeated, her voice gaining strength. She reached up and began to unpin her hair, letting the dark honey waves tumble down over her shoulders. It was a gesture of profound intimacy, a deliberate dismantling of her daytime armor. She was not the hired hand, not the housekeeper. She was a woman, and she was his. She saw the conflict in his eyes, the war between his guilt and a deep, buried longing. He was a man starved of touch, of tenderness. She was offering him not just her body, but a port in the storm of his emotions, a way to anchor himself back to his sworn duty. In that moment, she was no longer the timid schoolteacher. She was a woman fighting for her life, for her marriage, for her future. She moved toward him and, with a trembling hand, reached up and touched his cheek. His skin was rough from the wind and sun. He closed his eyes at her touch, a shudder running through his powerful frame. It was a surrender. She led him to the bed. Their union was not one of wild passion, but of a quiet, desperate intensity. It was clumsy and tender, a search for connection in the darkness. For Clara, it was an act of claiming, a branding of her rights onto his very soul. For Eli, it was a profound and confusing mix of comfort and transgression, a flight from one guilt into the arms of another. He was with his wife, as he should be, but the ghost of another woman's kiss still burned on his lips. The next morning, the first rays of sun slanted through the window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. Eli was awake, sitting on the edge of the bed, his head in his hands. The weight of his actions, of the kiss and of the night, pressed down on him with suffocating force. He felt he had betrayed both women, betrayed himself. He was a man adrift, his moral compass spinning wildly. Clara stirred beside him. She sat up, pulling the quilt around her shoulders, and looked at his bowed back. She could feel the waves of self-loathing coming off him. She knew what he was feeling, what he was thinking. She reached out and laid a gentle hand on his back. He stiffened, but didn't pull away. He couldn't look at her. "Eli," she said, her voice clear and calm in the quiet morning air. He braced himself for the tears, the accusations, the righteous anger he so richly deserved. But it never came. Instead, she said 5 words that would change everything, words of such unexpected grace that they cut through his guilt like a shard of glass. "I will not hold you with sorrow." He slowly raised his head, turning to look at her in stunned disbelief. Her gray eyes were clear, steady, and held no trace of recrimination. There was sadness in them. Yes, but there was also an immense, unyielding strength he had never seen before. She would not be a weeping victim. She would not use his guilt as a weapon. She was offering him not a cage, but a choice. And in that moment, he realized that the quiet, dutiful woman he had married was more formidable, more complex, and more terrifyingly strong than he had ever imagined. Clara's act of grace, her quiet refusal to wield Eli's guilt as a weapon, did not bring peace. Instead, it plunged the small cabin into a state of suspended animation. The air grew thick with unspoken words, with choices that loomed like thunderheads on the horizon. Eli, caught between the wife to whom he was bound by vow and unforeseen strength, and the first love to whom he was bound by a history that refused to die, was a man paralyzed. He moved through his days like a ghost, his face a mask of torment, the war within him visible in the haunted depths of his eyes. The fragile truce was broken by the arrival of a rider from Fort Laramie, a boy on a sweating horse who delivered a letter into Miriam's hands. As she read the thin, creased paper, the little color that had returned to her face drained away. The letter was from her cousins. Their words were polite but cool, offering her a place not as family, but as a hired hand. She could have a roof over her head, a bed in an attic room, in exchange for looking after their children and helping with the house. It was charity dressed in the plain clothes of employment. It was a future of servitude and loneliness, a life sentence of being a poor relation, a constant, quiet reminder of all she had lost. She folded the letter with hands that trembled slightly. "They've written back," she announced to the silent cabin. "There is a place for me. I'll leave in the morning." The finality of her words struck Eli like a physical blow. This was the solution he should have prayed for. Miriam would be gone. The temptation, the daily reminder of his failure, would be removed. He could begin, somehow, to repair the fractured pieces of his marriage to Clara. It was the honorable, logical, and right thing to happen. So why did the thought of her leaving feel like an amputation? Clara received the news with her usual unreadable composure. "I will pack you some provisions for the journey," she said, her voice even. She began to move about the cabin, gathering dried meat, wrapping a loaf of bread, her actions methodical, a stark contrast to the chaotic turmoil that had seized the other two occupants of the room. That night was Miriam's last. A cold, clear sky arched over the prairie, filled with a spill of stars so bright they seemed to crackle in the silence. After the tense, silent supper, Eli escaped the suffocating confines of the cabin and went to the corral, leaning on the rough-hewn fence and staring out into the vast, indifferent darkness. He felt a presence beside him and knew, without turning, that it was Miriam. She stood next to him, not touching, her gaze also fixed on the star-dusted horizon. "It's beautiful here," she said softly. "So quiet. I'd forgotten what quiet felt like." Eli couldn't speak. His throat was tight with a knot of grief and regret. "The life I've lived, Eli," she began, her voice barely a whisper. "My husband, he never saw me. He saw a thing he owned, something to use and to hurt, for years. I wasn't a person. I was just fear. I was a body that cooked and cleaned and flinched when he came near." She turned to look at him, her face a pale oval in the starlight, her eyes gleaming with unshed tears. "And then I had my son, and I was a mother. That was everything. It was the only clean, good thing in my life. Now, he's gone, and I'm nothing again." "That's not true, Miriam," Eli said, his voice hoarse. "What am I?" she challenged, a tremor of desperation in her voice. "A widow, a beggar, soon to be a servant. I'm a collection of tragedies. Eli, that's all that's left of me." She took a ragged breath and stepped closer, her voice dropping to a raw, pleading whisper that pierced him to the core. "Tomorrow, I go to that new life, and I'll be what they expect me to be. I'll be quiet and grateful and I'll disappear. But for tonight, for just this one night, I want to feel something else." She looked up at him, her soul stripped bare in her gaze. "I want to remember what it feels like to be a woman. Not a victim, not a mother who failed, not a beggar, a woman. To be held by a man who sees me. To feel, just once more, like I'm alive and not just surviving. I'm not asking for promises. Eli, I'm not asking to take anything from your wife. I am begging you to give me one memory of warmth to take with me into the cold. Let me live, just for one night, without being afraid." Her plea shattered the last of his defenses. Every ounce of his being screamed at him to say no, to turn away, to honor the woman inside the cabin who had shown him a mercy he did not deserve. The image of Clara's strong, steady eyes flashed before him, a beacon of duty and honor. But Miriam's face, etched with years of pain and a desperate, fleeting hope, was a force of nature, a tide of shared history and profound love that he had been fighting his entire adult life. He saw the girl in the aspen grove, full of laughter and life. He saw the woman he had abandoned to a brutal fate. He saw the survivor who had crawled through a blizzard to his door. He saw the culmination of all his choices, all his failures, standing before him, asking for one single night of solace. A great, shuddering sigh escaped him, the sound of a final, complete surrender. It was the sound of a man breaking. He reached out and pulled her to him, his mouth finding hers in the darkness. It was not a kiss of tenderness. It was a kiss of raw, unrestrained hunger, of years of repressed longing, of shared grief and desperate passion. It was a confession, a prayer, and a sin all at once. He swept her up into his arms and carried her not to the house, but to the barn, kicking the door shut behind them. In the scent of hay and dust and leather, under the silent watch of the sleeping animals, they came together. It was a feverish, frantic collision, a desperate attempt to burn away the years of pain and loneliness. For Eli, it was the undoing of a lifetime of restraint, a flood of emotion so powerful it threatened to drown him. For Miriam, it was a reclamation, a fierce, defiant act of feeling pleasure, of being desired, of being wholly and completely alive in her own skin. It was passionate and consuming, a moment of pure, blinding connection forged in the heart of a profound and terrible betrayal. They were two lost souls clinging to each other in the darkness, seeking a redemption that they both knew would cost them everything. The first hint of dawn was a pale gray wash in the eastern sky when Eli stumbled from the barn. The cold air hit him like a physical slap, clearing the haze of passion and leaving behind the icy residue of guilt. He walked not to his own room, but to the main room of the cabin, slumping into the chair by the cold hearth, a man utterly defeated. An hour later, the smell of coffee and frying bacon filled the air. Eli looked up, his eyes gritty with exhaustion and shame. Clara stood at the stove, her back to him, her movements as calm and deliberate as they were every other morning. The fire was lit. The coffee was brewing. The routine of the day was proceeding as if the world had not been irrevocably broken during the night. Miriam emerged from the barn a few minutes later, her face pale, her eyes shadowed. She paused in the doorway, her gaze flickering from Eli's slumped form to Clara's rigid back. The silence in the cabin was absolute, broken only by the sizzle of the bacon in the skillet. Clara turned from the stove, a platter of food in her hands. She placed it on the table. Her eyes met Eli's, then moved to Miriam. Her face was a mask of serene composure, but her eyes were a different story. They were not filled with the fire of anger or the water of tears. They were calm, yes, but it was the chilling calm of a deep, frozen lake, and in their depths, Eli saw a pain so profound, so complete, that it made his own guilt feel shallow. She knew. She didn't need to have seen or heard. She knew it in her soul. She looked at them both, the betrayer and the betrayed, and in that single, steady gaze, she passed a silent, devastating judgment. She sat at the table. "Breakfast is ready," she said, her voice perfectly level.
You must eat before your journey. Miriam?
The journey. The word hung in the air. Miriam looked at Eli, whose eyes were fixed on the wooden floor, unable to meet anyone's gaze. She looked at Clara, a pillar of impossible strength, and she looked at the door, at the path that led away from this place to a life of cold servitude, after a night where she had finally, briefly, felt alive. The thought of that future was unbearable. With a quiet resolve, she walked to the table and sat down across from Clara.
I'm not going,
she said, her voice soft but firm. She didn't look at Eli. Her words were for Clara. It was a challenge, a confession, and a plea. She had made her move. Now, the choice belonged to Eli. The days that followed were a form of exquisite torture. Eli was a man caught between two immovable forces. Clara, with her righteous claim and silent suffering. Miriam, with her resurrected love and her refusal to be cast aside again. The homestead became a pressure cooker of silent recriminations and desperate, unspoken needs. The insular world of the ranch could not hold the secret forever. On a trip to Laramie for supplies, Eli felt the change instantly. The usual gruff greetings from the other ranchers were replaced with curt nods. Men who would normally share a drink with him at the saloon turned their backs when he entered. The women stared, their whispers ceasing the moment he looked their way, their eyes filled with a mixture of scorn and salacious curiosity. Reverend Brown, the town's moral authority, fixed him with a stare of pure, righteous condemnation from across the dusty street. The word was out. Eli Carson, the quiet, solitary rancher, was living in sin, keeping his wife and a widow under the same roof. He was a scandal, a sinner. The full force of the town's judgment fell upon Clara. A week later, when she rode into town for thread and sugar, she was met with a wall of open hostility. Mrs. Gable, the mercantile owner's wife, served her with pursed lips and disdainful silence. As Clara was counting her change, a group of women, the self-appointed guardians of the town's virtue, stood nearby, their voices deliberately loud. "A disgrace," one of them said. "No decent woman would allow such a thing in her home. She has no shame." "It's him," another added. "A man can't serve two masters." Or in his case, a cruel titter of laughter followed. The Clara of a few months ago would have flushed with shame and fled. But this Clara was different. She slowly placed her change in her reticule, her movements deliberate. She turned to face the women, her back straight, her head held high. Her calm, gray eyes, now honed to a fine point, met theirs without flinching. "My husband's home is my home. Ladies," she said, her voice not loud, but carrying with a chilling clarity that cut through their whispers, "and the hospitality we offer is our business." I would have thought Christian women would have more pressing matters to concern them than the contents of my larder or the guests at my table. She gave them a look that was pure ice. "Good day." She turned and walked out of the store, leaving a stunned, indignant silence in her wake. That night, the fragile peace in the cabin finally broke, but not in the way one might expect. Eli had gone to the barn, seeking refuge as he now often did. The two women were left alone in the flickering lamplight. It was Miriam who spoke first. "I saw what happened in town," she said quietly. "I heard what they said. This is my fault. I should have left." Clara was mending one of Eli's shirts, her needle moving with a steady, rhythmic precision. She didn't look up. And gone where? To a life of servitude, to be a ghost in someone else's house. Miriam stared at her, astonished. "You defend me?" Clara finally set her sewing aside and looked at Miriam, her gaze direct and searching. "What I defend is my home. What I defend is my right to live without the judgment of hypocrites." She paused, her expression softening into something weary, something ancient. "I do not condone what has happened between you and my husband. It is a wound in me that may never heal. Do not mistake my meaning on that.
Then why? Miriam whispered. Why do you endure this?
Because I have nowhere else to go either, Clara replied, the simple, honest words hanging in the air between them. Do you think I don't lie awake at night and wish I were back in Pennsylvania? But that life is gone. This is my life now. This harsh, unforgiving land, this quiet, tormented man, this house, with you in it. For the first time, there were no barriers between them, no rivalry, only a shared, stark reality. They were two different women, from different worlds, who loved the same man in different ways, but they were also simply women, isolated on the vast, lonely frontier, their lives and fates inextricably tied to the choices of a man who was as lost as they were.
It is a lonely place for a woman, this land,
Clara said, more to herself than to Miriam.
We are expected to be strong, but silent, to endure, but not to feel,
to build a home, but have no say in who is allowed to dwell within it. Miriam looked at the capable, resilient woman across from her, the wife of the man she loved, and saw not an enemy, but a fellow prisoner. Yes, Miriam agreed, her voice thick with emotion.
It is a lonely place.
There were no more words. There was no absolution, no forgiveness asked for or given. But in the quiet, shared space of the cabin, a silent, profound understanding was reached. It was not friendship. It was an alliance, born of mutual sorrow and a shared, desperate will to survive. The battle lines had been redrawn. It was no longer Clara versus Miriam for the heart of Eli Carson. It was the three of them, a strange and broken family, against the world. The alliance forged between Clara and Miriam in the quiet of the lamplit cabin was not a thing of words, but of shared atmosphere. A silent treaty was drawn, and the homestead settled into a strange, new rhythm, a life lived in a state of profound and precarious limbo. No one defined the new order. There were no discussions, no setting of rules. The relationships between the three of them were simply allowed to exist, as wild and unplotted as the prairie that surrounded them. They became a three-bodied entity, moving through the days with a tense but functional grace. Clara remained the undisputed mistress of the cabin's interior. She was the anchor of their domestic world, her steady hands bringing order to the chaos of their lives. She orchestrated the meals, the mending, the cleaning, creating a predictable structure that held them all together. Her presence was a quiet, constant hum of civilized normalcy in a situation that was anything but normal. She was the wife, and she never let either of them forget the quiet authority that came with that title. Miriam, in turn, found her domain in the world just outside the cabin door. She had a natural, almost mystical affinity for the animals. She tended the chickens, helped Eli with the cattle, and possessed a surprising knowledge of wild herbs and remedies, things she had learned during her years of wandering. She was the untamed element, her energy a stark contrast to Clara's measured composure. She brought a resilience born of pure survival, a practical, earthy wisdom that complemented Clara's more structured knowledge. And Eli was the tormented center, the axis around which these two female worlds revolved. He was bound to Clara by law, by honor, and by a growing, awed respect for the woman of steel she had revealed herself to be. He was bound to Miriam by the unbreakable chains of first love, by a guilt that gnawed at his soul, and by a passion that, once reawakened, refused to be put back to sleep. He was the husband of one, and the lover, in heart, if no longer in body, of the other. The nights were a particular agony. He slept in his own room, alone, the door closed. He knew that on either side of him, in the same small cabin, were the two halves of his fractured soul. He belonged fully to neither, and was responsible for both. They were a family of ghosts, haunted by what was, what could have been, and what could never be spoken of. Yet, within this impossible structure, a strange kind of intimacy grew. It was not the intimacy of lovers, but of fellow soldiers in a long and silent war. It was in the way Miriam would leave a bucket of freshly gathered eggs just inside the door for Clara, a silent offering. It was in the way Clara would ensure a hot plate of food was saved for Miriam when she came in late from the barn. It was in the way they would both watch Eli, their gazes sometimes crossing over his bowed head in a moment of shared, unspoken understanding of the burden he carried. They were not friends, but they were no longer rivals. They were partners in the complex, exhausting business of managing the heart of one very broken man. This fragile, self-contained world could not, however, remain untouched. The town of Laramie, having tasted the scent of scandal, was not content to let it fade. The whispers and stares solidified into a formal, righteous indignation. And that indignation needed a voice. The voice belonged to Reverend Brown. He arrived one Tuesday afternoon, not alone, but with a grim-faced delegation consisting of Mr. Gable from the Mercantile and another town elder, a rancher named Peterson, whose face was set in lines of stern disapproval. They rode up to the cabin as if approaching a den of iniquity, their postures stiff, their eyes hard. Eli met them on the porch, his own face a thunderous mask. He did not invite them in. "Carson," the Reverend began, his voice imbued with the somber authority he used in the pulpit. "We are here as concerned neighbors and as servants of the Lord." "I've got work to do, Reverend," Eli said, his voice a low growl. "State your business." "Your soul is our business," Reverend Brown declared, undeterred. "And the moral fabric of this community? We have tolerated this situation for weeks, hoping you would come to your senses. But your defiance has become a stain on us all. You are living in open violation of God's law." "I'm living in my own home," Eli countered, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. "With another man's wife, Mr. Gable interjected, his tone sharp and businesslike. "No, wait, with your own wife, and a companion. It's bad for the town. Carson, it sets a terrible example. It invites wickedness." "What you are doing is an abomination," the Reverend thundered. "You have a lawful, wedded wife, a good woman from all accounts, and yet you keep this other woman, this widow of ill repute, under your roof. You cannot continue this way. It is a path to damnation." From inside the cabin, Clara and Miriam listened, frozen, to every word. "The town council has discussed this," Peterson added, his voice heavy. "We are giving you a choice. Eli, send the woman away. Return to a righteous life with your wife. If you refuse, there will be consequences." "Is that a threat?" Eli's voice was dangerously low. "It is a promise," Reverend Brown said. "We are holding a community meeting at the church on Saturday evening. We expect you, and both women, to be there, to answer for your lifestyle, to repent. If you do not, you will find that this community has ways of making its displeasure known." They turned and rode away, leaving a cloud of dust and righteous fury in their wake. Eli stood on the porch for a long time, his body rigid with a rage that had no outlet. This was his mother's legacy, this judgment, this belief that a man's life could be governed by the harsh opinions of others. He had fought against it his whole life, and now it had come to his door with the force of an ultimatum. The day of the meeting arrived, cloaked in a tense, gray twilight. The three of them rode to town in the wagon, a silent, grim procession. They had barely spoken in the intervening days, each lost in their own fears. As they entered the church, a hush fell over the assembled townsfolk. Every eye was on them. The air was thick with condemnation, a suffocating blanket of piety and morbid curiosity. They sat alone in the front pew, a small, isolated island in a sea of hostile faces. Reverend Brown stood at the pulpit, his Bible open, though he did not read from it. He was not here to preach, but to prosecute. He began with a long, rambling sermon on the sanctity of marriage, the evils of temptation, and the cancer of sin that could destroy a community from within. His gaze kept returning to the front pew, to the three figures sitting straight-backed and silent. Finally, he addressed them directly. Eli Carson, you were raised in this community. Your mother was a God-fearing woman. How have you fallen so far? How can you bring this shame upon your house, upon your good wife? Before Eli could answer, Miriam stood up. Her movement was sudden, decisive, and it drew a collective gasp from the crowd. She was pale, but her chin was held high, and her moss-green eyes were clear and direct as she faced the Reverend. "This is not his shame," she said, her voice ringing with a strength no one expected. "It is mine." The Reverend stared at her, momentarily taken aback. "Woman, you will have your time to speak." "I will speak now," Miriam insisted, her voice cutting through his. "You speak of sin and temptation, then you should know where the fault lies. It lies with me. I came to this man's door, desperate and half dead. He and his wife took me in. They showed me Christian charity, the very thing you preach from that pulpit." Her gaze swept across the hostile faces in the crowd. "But I was weak. I was grieving and alone. I imposed upon their kindness. I used my past connection to Mr. Carson to stay when I should have left. If there was a temptation, I was the temptress. If a sin was committed, the sin was mine. Mr. Carson is a good man who was led astray by my weakness and my desperation. His wife is an innocent victim of my selfishness." She turned her eyes, filled with a profound sorrow, toward Eli. "Punish me, Reverend. Cast me out, but leave this family in peace. The fault is mine and mine alone." She sat down, her body trembling with the effort, having offered herself up for sacrifice. A murmur went through the crowd. This was the neat, tidy explanation they had wanted. A good man, a virtuous wife, and a wicked woman. Eli started to rise, a furious denial on his lips, ready to refute her words, to claim his own share of the blame. But before he could speak, a second figure rose beside him. It was Clara. She stood for a moment in complete silence, her calm, gray eyes surveying the congregation. She was not a warrior like Miriam. She did not possess that wild, defiant fire. But in that moment, she radiated an authority that was absolute, an unassailable dignity that silenced the whispers. She turned her gaze to Reverend Brown, and her voice, when she spoke, was not loud, but it carried to every corner of the packed room. It was the clear, precise voice of a schoolteacher commanding the attention of her pupils. "Reverend," she began, "you have heard this testimony. You seem satisfied with it. It paints a simple picture of good and evil, one that I'm sure is very comforting to you all." A flicker of something sharp and dangerous glinted in her eyes. "But I am afraid I must complicate that picture for you." She took a step forward, away from the pew, standing alone before them all. "You call me an innocent victim. I am not a victim. I am the lady of that house, and nothing happens under my roof without my knowledge and my consent." A shocked silence fell over the room. "Miriam is in our home because I wish her to be there," Clara continued, her voice unwavering. "She was brought to us by a storm, a soul in need, and we gave her shelter. She is a woman who has suffered more than any of you can possibly imagine. And you would call her a sinner for seeking refuge? You would call my husband a sinner for offering it?" She turned her gaze fully on the Reverend, her eyes like chips of granite. "You speak of sin, Reverend Brown. Let us speak of sin. Is it a sin to show compassion? Is it a sin to feed the hungry and shelter the homeless? Or is the greater sin to sit in judgment, to cast stones, to turn your backs on a neighbor in need?" Her voice rose, filled now with a cold, righteous anger that stunned the assembly into submission. "You want to place blame. You want a sinner to punish. Miriam has offered herself to you, but I will not allow it. She is a guest in my home, and she is under my protection." She took a deep breath and delivered the final, devastating blow. "Therefore, if the act of offering her a place of safety in this harsh world is a sin, then I am the chief sinner. If you condemn her, then you must condemn me, for I am a party to all that has happened. and I will not stand here and allow you to sacrifice this woman to soothe your own fragile conscience." She stood there, defiant and unbreakable. She had not confessed to a crime of passion, but to a crime of compassion. She had reframed the entire debate, turning their own Christian morality against them. She had declared her solidarity not just with her husband, but with the other woman. She had declared them a unit, a family, and dared the town to stand against them. No one knew what to say. The clear lines of blame had been irrevocably blurred. The simple narrative was destroyed. The Reverend opened and closed his mouth, but no words came out. The townsfolk stared, their expressions a mixture of confusion, grudging respect, and deep-seated disapproval. The meeting ended not with a verdict, but with a quiet, awkward dispersal. No one was formally condemned. No stones were cast. But the town had its revenge. The judgment was not delivered from the pulpit, but from behind the counters of the mercantile, from the anvil of the blacksmith, from the averted eyes of their neighbors. The Carson Ranch was now an island, completely and utterly isolated. When Eli went to town, Mr. Gable would not sell him supplies on credit, demanding cash that was in short supply. The blacksmith was always too busy to shoe his horses. No one would buy his cattle. They were pariahs, shunned not with overt aggression, but with a quiet, suffocating wall of silence. The isolation forced them inward, making them rely solely on each other. As the first snows of a long, brutal winter began to fall, their world shrank to the size of the 320-acre ranch. They were no longer three separate people living in a tense truce, but a single entity fighting for its survival against the wilderness and the silent judgment of the world. The true test came in the dead of winter, when a wave of sickness swept through the territory. It was Eli who fell ill first, his relentless work and the heavy weight of his emotional turmoil having weakened his body's defenses. He collapsed one afternoon while chopping wood, and the women had to half carry him back to the cabin. For a week, he was lost in a feverish delirium, his powerful frame weakened and vulnerable. In that small, snowbound cabin, Clara and Miriam became a seamless team. All rivalry, all jealousy, was burned away by the singular, terrifying fear of losing him. Clara, with her methodical calm, was in charge of the sick room, bathing his brow, forcing broth between his lips, keeping the fire stoked. Miriam, with her knowledge of the wild, brewed potent herbal teas to fight the fever and made poultices for the racking cough that shook his body. They worked in shifts, their movements synchronized, their communication a language of weary glances and quiet, single-word questions. They were no longer wife and other woman. They were two nurses, two caretakers, two women fighting for the life of their man. One night, during the worst of the fever, they sat together by the fire, listening to Eli's ragged breathing from the other room. A blizzard raged outside, the wind shrieking like a banshee. The cabin felt like the last bastion of warmth and life in a dead, frozen world.
"He's strong,"
Miriam whispered, more to reassure herself than Clara.
"He'll pull through." "He has to,"
Clara replied, her voice thick with exhaustion. She looked at Miriam, her gaze soft in the firelight.
"Thank you for your help. I wouldn't have known what to do about the fever tea, and I would have let the fire go out a dozen times,"
Miriam admitted with a small, sad smile.
"You are the strong one. Clara, I never knew how strong."
In that moment, they saw each other clearly, stripped of all artifice. They were not defined by their relationship to Eli, but by their own intrinsic worth. When Eli's fever finally broke, he woke to find Clara asleep in a chair on one side of his bed, and Miriam asleep on a pallet of blankets on the other. He was weak, but his mind was clear for the first time in a week. He looked at these two women who had saved his life, who had stayed and fought for him, and a wave of emotion so powerful it was physically painful washed over him. A few nights later, he was well enough to sit by the fire, wrapped in a heavy quilt. The blizzard had passed, leaving behind a world of deep, silent snow. The three of them sat together, watching the flames dance. The silence was no longer tense or awkward. It was a comfortable, peaceful quiet, the silence of survivors. Eli looked from Clara's calm, strong profile to Miriam's resilient, beautiful face. He felt a profound sense of peace settle over him, a quiet acceptance of the impossible truth of his life. He reached out, his hand finding Clara's. She took it, her fingers lacing with his. Then, he extended his other hand toward Miriam. After a moment's hesitation, she placed her hand in his. He held them both, a living link between these two disparate, powerful women. He gently pulled them closer, and for the first time, they all came together in a shared embrace. Clara rested her head on one of his shoulders, Miriam on the other. His arms encircled them both, holding them tight against him, a small, unlikely fortress of three against the cold. There was no passion in the touch, no sense of transgression. There was only the profound, steady warmth of three bodies, of three hearts beating in the quiet of the firelit cabin. No one was a stranger. No one was an outsider. In the heart of their isolation, they had finally, truly, become a family. The winter did not release its grip with grace. It broke apart in a series of violent thaws and refreezes, leaving the land a muddy, pockmarked mess. But then, one morning, the wind changed. The incessant, biting cold that had defined their lives for months was gone, replaced by a soft, warm breeze that carried the scent of wet earth and the distant promise of life. Spring arrived in Wyoming not as a gentle maiden, but as a powerful, messy, and glorious force of resurrection. The snow receded, revealing the pale, flattened grass beneath. The creek, which had been a solid ribbon of ice, began to crack and groan, then swelled into a rushing, muddy torrent on the south-facing slopes. The first improbable green shoots of grass appeared, and soon after, the prairie was dotted with the vibrant, delicate colors of wildflowers, purple lupine, yellow balsam root, and the shy white of the sand lily. Life was returning, with a fierce, unstoppable urgency. The change in the landscape mirrored the change within the cabin. The long, brutal winter of their isolation had forged them into something new. The sharp edges of their individual griefs and grievances had been worn smooth by the constant friction of shared survival. The fever that had almost taken Eli had burned away the last vestiges of their old resentments, leaving behind the clean, solid bedrock of their interdependence. They emerged from the cabin not as three individuals, but as a single, functioning unit. Their days fell into a new rhythm, one of cooperation born not of necessity, but of a deep, unspoken understanding. They moved as one to reclaim the ranch from the damages of winter. Eli, his strength fully returned, worked the fields, the muscles in his back and shoulders straining as he guided the plow through the damp, rich soil. His movements were steady and powerful, the work of a man who had found a new, quiet purpose. Clara followed behind him, her steps light on the turned earth. She was no longer just the keeper of the house. She was a partner in the land. She carried the seed bags, her once soft hands, now strong and capable, expertly dropping seeds into the furrows. She had learned the language of the land, could read the texture of the soil, and knew by the feel of the wind if rain was coming. A quiet, deep-seated contentment had settled in her features, chasing away the last shadows of the lonely woman who had arrived months before. And Miriam worked alongside them, her energy a vital, vibrant force. She cleared the rock-strewn patches of land that Eli's plow could not reach, her movements filled with a fluid strength. She established a large and ambitious garden near the house, planting not just vegetables for their table, but a wide array of herbs for her remedies. She had found her calling not just in healing, but in nurturing life from the soil, her hands seemingly capable of coaxing growth from the most stubborn patch of ground. They worked in a comfortable, productive silence, each anticipating the other's needs. A shared glance. A simple nod. This was the extent of their communication. They were a well-oiled machine, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. It was Miriam, with her keen, observant eyes and her intuitive understanding of the body, who noticed the change in Clara first. It was subtle things, a fleeting wave of dizziness that made Clara pause and press a hand to her forehead. A new, almost imperceptible weariness in her posture at the end of a long day. A sudden aversion to the smell of coffee, a beverage she had always enjoyed. One afternoon, as they were weeding the garden together under the warm sun, Clara suddenly straightened up, her face pale, a hand pressed to her stomach. "Are you well, Clara?" Miriam asked, her voice soft, devoid of anything but genuine concern. "I'm fine," Clara said quickly, a faint blush rising on her cheeks. "Just a momentary spell. The sun is strong today." But Miriam's gaze was knowing. She looked at Clara's form, at the slight thickening of her waist that was just barely visible beneath her practical calico dress. A slow, gentle smile touched Miriam's lips. She did not press the issue. She simply went into the cabin and returned with a dipper of cool water and a stool. "Rest a moment," she said. "The weeds will wait." That evening, after Eli had gone to the barn for the final check on the animals, Clara approached Miriam as she was grinding herbs at the main table.
"You know, don't you?"
Clara's voice was barely a whisper. Miriam looked up, her expression soft. "I suspected, for how long?"
"I believe since just after the sickness,"
Clara admitted, her hand moving instinctively to rest on her lower belly. "At first, I thought I was just tired from the strain of it all." A complex mix of emotions played across Miriam's face, a flicker of old sorrow for the child she had lost, quickly replaced by a genuine, unselfish warmth for the new life that was to come. "It is a blessing, Clara, a true blessing." When Eli was told, his reaction was one of stunned, profound silence. Clara told him that night, in the quiet of the main room, her voice steady despite the tremor of emotion she felt. He stood motionless for a long time, his gaze distant, as if he were looking at a future he had never dared to imagine. He looked at Clara, at the gentle swell of her abdomen, and then his eyes moved to Miriam, who stood by the fire, giving them their space yet inextricably a part of the moment. This child was not just his and Clara's. This child was a product of this house, of this strange and impossible family. It was conceived in a desperate act of claiming, but it would be born into a world forged by all three of them. It was the physical manifestation of their new life, a symbol of hope growing in the wake of their shared tragedy. Eli crossed the room and pulled Clara into a gentle embrace, his hand coming to rest alongside hers on her stomach. Then he reached his other hand out to Miriam. She took it without hesitation, and for a moment, they stood as they had that night by the fire, a circle of three, now with a fourth, unseen life at its center. News, even in a community that had shunned them, had a way of traveling. The story of how the Carson homestead had survived the winter, of how they had nursed Eli through a near-fatal illness, had slowly seeped into the town's consciousness. People in the West, for all their rigid morality, held one value above all others: toughness. Survival commanded respect. The Carsons, in their isolation, had proven they were survivors. The scandal was still a juicy piece of gossip, but it was now tinged with a grudging admiration. They were strange. Yes, sinners, perhaps, but they were undeniably tough. The first crack in their isolation came from an unexpected source: the Peterson family. Mr. Peterson, the rancher who had been part of the Reverend's delegation, appeared at their gate one day, his hat in his hands, his face a mask of awkward discomfort. His wife sat in the wagon, her expression just as strained. "Carson," Peterson began, avoiding Eli's eyes. "Ma'am," he gave a stiff nod to Clara and Miriam, who stood on the porch. "We have a situation." It turned out their youngest son, a boy of 10, was running wild. With no school in the immediate area, he was growing up without discipline or learning. They had heard that Mrs. Carson had been a teacher back east, with a great deal of difficulty. Peterson finally managed to ask if she would be willing to tutor the boy. He offered to pay, in cash or in kind. Clara looked at Eli, who gave a slight, permissive nod.
"I would be happy to,"
Clara said, her voice betraying none of the immense significance of the moment.
"Have him here on Monday morning at 9.
The Peterson boy was the first. Within a month, there were 3 other children, from 2 other ranches, whose parents had swallowed their pride and sought out the pariah teacher. Clara established a small school in a corner of the main room, her corner of the world once again filled with the satisfying sounds of chalk on a slate and the earnest recitation of multiplication tables. She had reclaimed her old identity, her purpose, and with it came a new, quiet authority that radiated from her. As Clara's school became an accepted, if still slightly scandalous, part of the community, Miriam's role as a healer also began to grow. When one of Clara's students came down with a croupy cough, Miriam's herbal remedy worked faster than any of the expensive tonics from the mercantile. Soon, a rancher's wife with a persistent rash, a blacksmith with a badly burned hand, and others began to make the quiet trip out to the Carson homestead, seeking out the other woman and her strange, effective cures. Miriam, the outcast, had become the community's healer. She asked for nothing in return, and her quiet competence and gentle hands slowly eroded the town's fear and replaced it with a dependent respect. One evening in late summer, Eli stood watching the 2 women. Clara was on the porch, patiently explaining a passage from a book to the Peterson boy, who was staying late. Her belly was large and round now, and she had the serene, luminous glow of late pregnancy. Inside, Miriam was grinding herbs, the rhythmic sound a comforting beat in the heart of the home. A young woman, the wife of a ranch hand, sat with her, her head bowed as she described her mother's ailments. Eli picked up his tools. For weeks, he had been felling trees, squaring logs, and preparing a new foundation. The cabin, once built for 2 and now straining to hold 3 and a coming child, was too small. But he was not simply adding a room. He was reshaping their home to reflect the reality of their lives. He began to build a new, small structure that connected Clara's original room with his own, creating a shared central space that flowed between them. It was a physical rejection of the old hierarchy. There was no longer a main room and 2 separate, closed-off bedrooms. There was a fluid, interconnected space. It was the architecture of their family, made real in wood and stone. There would be no main wife and other woman. There would only be their home. The late summer sun was a ball of molten gold on the horizon, painting the vast Wyoming sky in strokes of orange, purple, and fiery pink. The day's work was done. The last of Clara's students had gone home. The 3 of them sat together on the newly built porch, a comfortable silence settling over them as they watched the day die. The air was warm and smelled of hay and dust and the sweet scent of the prairie evening. A cool breeze whispered through the tall grass. Eli sat in a sturdy chair he had built, with Clara on one side, her head resting comfortably on his shoulder, and Miriam on the other, her chair close enough that their arms brushed. He looked at the 2 women who flanked him, the twin pillars of his impossible life. He looked at Clara, his wife, the woman who had come to him a stranger and had, through sheer force of will and a grace he would never fully comprehend, become the anchor of his world. She had faced down a hostile town and the turmoil in her own home with a strength he never knew existed. She was carrying his child. She had not saved him from his past, but she had given him a future. She had saved his soul from the lonely, bitter fortress he had built around it. Then he looked at Miriam, his first love, the ghost from his past who had returned and forced him to confront the man he had been and the man he had become. She had been broken, and in healing her, he had begun to heal the oldest, deepest wound in himself. She had reawakened his heart, reminding him that he was capable of a passion he thought had died long ago. She had saved his heart from being frozen forever. One had rescued his soul, the other his heart, and he, in the middle, had somehow become whole. The torment was gone, replaced by a profound, quiet gratitude that was so immense it felt like a prayer. He no longer saw them as two separate choices, two opposing forces. They were simply two halves of his reality, two essential parts of the strange and beautiful life they had built together in the heart of the wilderness. He reached out, his calloused hands finding theirs, his fingers lacing with theirs. They sat for a long time, joined together, watching the last sliver of sun disappear below the edge of the world. In the gathering twilight, Eli leaned his head back and spoke, his voice a low, soft whisper, meant only for them. "I no longer keep separate names for you in my heart," he said, his gaze moving between their two faces, bathed in the soft alpenglow. "We now share one home. Thank you for listening to our story. We'd love to know where you're tuning in from, so please leave a comment below and let's connect. Don't forget to subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts on Eli, Clara, and Miriam's journey.